G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and this is the third part in my series on the Rings of Power. Normally, as you know, I don't really go into talking about TV shows and media too much. It's not really the focus of this channel, but being such a Tolkien fan, I feel like I have some sort of duty to do so, to try and explain these characters, at least for those who don't know them or understand the world or the universe of Tolkien to the level that some of us do. And therefore they don't see why we might dislike how the show lays out certain characters. So I wanted to put these videos, I wanted to put them up as polls on YouTube and say, what one should I do next? And actually Elrond beat out Gil-Galad. But in order to understand Elrond, you kind of need to know about Gil-Galad first. Now my intention was to focus on the Elven King, but well, as I sat down, all these little side distractions and weird lore quirks, they just kept popping up along the way. So please forgive me as I go through, because there's going to be some tangents. I'll also take the opportunity to apologise right up front for my poor Elven pronunciation. I'm an Australian, my accent is thick, and the lack of verbal skills I have means that I will never do a good job pronouncing the names correctly, but I'll try not to butcher it too badly. So, to start with a little bit on him. So his father is either Fingon, who's the cousin of Galadriel, or Orodreth, who's her brother, depending on which chronology you prefer. For me, it's the latter, and the timeline works better for him being born in Middle-earth and thus a pretty young king when he actually becomes the king of the Noldor. His father ruled Minas Tirith. No, not the one that you're thinking of, the Peter Jackson film one. Minas Tirith is an Elven term, and it means the Tower of the Guard, and the one of the Peter Jackson films was originally named Minas Anor, and it gets renamed to Minas Tirith after Sauron takes Minas Ithil, I believe. So Minas Tirith of the First Age is actually on an island called Tol Sirion, and funny enough, it's an island on the river Sirion. Sensing impending doom, Orodreth sends his wife and his son to the havens of the Falas, into Círdan the shipwright's care. Now, Gil-Galad lives there until Morgoth destroys the havens after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, I believe it was, and Gil-Galad and Círdan then escape to the Isle of Valar with the rest of the Felethrim. After the death of Turgon and the fall of Gondolin, Gil-Galad becomes the king of the Noldor. When the sons of Feanor commit the third kinslaying, Gil-Galad receives word of their sacking of the havens of the Sirion, and he assembles an army to try and protect them or prevent this from occurring. However, he arrives too late after it has happened, and is unable to help them out. He then takes the survivors of the Sirion havens, and they now join with him, further increasing his power, and go with him to Belar, the island of Belar, where they tell him about Elrond and Elrost's captivity, because they're taken by two of the sons of Feanor. Now, after the War of Wrath, that's the war where Morgoth is finally overthrown, the remaining sons of Feanor vanish out of history. Madros commits suicide, while Magor disappeared without a trace, leaving Elrond and Elros alone. This is the point where Gil-Galad welcomes Elrond into his ranks as his herald, and Elros leaves to become the king of Numenor. This is, of course, after they choose their separate fates. Now, for the record, Elrond is actually Gil-Galad's second cousin, 3 times removed. Elrond actually is probably the best surviving claimant to the kingship of the Noldor, which he did not actually choose to claim, as it seems to be a cursed job. Every High King of the Noldor died a horrible death, including Finwë dying to Morgoth, Feanor to all the Balrogs, Fingolfin dies to Morgoth, admittedly in a badass duel which hobbled Morgoth permanently, Madros to Silmarili burn pain-induced suicide, it's complicated, Fingon to Balrogs, Turgon fighting to save the city of Gondolin, and Gil-Galad who was burned alive in Sauron's hands. For some reason Elrond didn't want the job. Anyway, in the Second Age, Gil-Galad remained in Middle-earth and established a realm in Lindon, which was geographically strong and secure against its enemies. At its height, his realm extended eastward as far as the Misty Mountains and the western parts of Greenwood the Great, though most of the elves actually remain in Lindon and Hollin. Later on, after the First War of the Elves and Sauron, after the One Ring is created, his people under Elrond establish a refuge in Rivendell. Now, Gil-Galad had an alliance with the men of Western East, which is the Numenorians, basically. And he does this able to create this alliance after meeting the Numenorian prince who'll become Tar Eldarion, known as Tar Eldarion the Mariner. He has a whole very interesting story, by the way, in the Book of Unfinished Tales about him, this character, about his life, his relationships, and his daughter Tar and Calame, who is the first ruling queen of Numenor. That's really good story material right there. Should have used that in a TV series. So, Gil-Galad reigned as High King of the Noldor throughout the Second Age. At some point, Gil-Galad and Elrond were approached by a stranger called Annatar, who called himself the Lord of Gifts. Now, fair seeming were his words and his offerings, but Gil-Galad perceived that this Annatar was not as he seemed. Therefore, he refused to have dealings with him and sent word abroad to all the elves that they should shun this stranger. Smart call. Another fun fact for you, during this time, Gil-Galad was actually given the seeds of the Melurin, or Melorn trees, by Tar Eldarion, and unfortunately the seeds wouldn't grow in his land, so he gave them to Galadriel when she left to go to Lindon. She actually carried those seeds for a very long time and finally planted them in Lindori, and when they grew there, it was renamed to Lorien of the Blossom. Now, Annatar was received in Eregion, where he taught the elves how to make the Rings of Power, but Gil-Galad's distrust gets proven to be correct because Annatar turns out to be Sauron in disguise, and the rings were tools for his wicked plans to dominate Middle-earth. Later on, Gil-Galad was entrusted by Celebrimbor with the elven rings of Vilya, Narnia, and, well, those were the two of the three rings he got. The third ring, Nenya, goes to Galadriel. So Sauron invaded Eriador and destroys everything that Celebrimbor basically lived for, kills, tortures him, all that, trying to get all of the rings, but can't find the elven rings. He pushes Gil-Galad and the Noldorian elves all the way back to essentially the Grey Havens. At this point, Gil-Galad is basically rescued in the war by the Numenorians, and they're able to launch a counterattack together with the force of Tar Minastir, who sends a great fleet, and they absolutely crush Sauron, who barely escapes with only his bodyguard, returning to Mordor, where it takes him almost 1,000 years to regain his strength. Now, after that 1,000 years, he again is confronted by the Numenorians, who take him back as a prisoner to their homeland, leaving Gil-Galad free to rule Middle-earth in peace. In Sauron's absence, Gil-Galad's power grew to the point where when Sauron returns to Middle-earth after the ruin of Numenor, he finds that, it's looking bad for him, believe it or not. As well as this, the survivors of Numenor, known as the Faithful, have arrived in Middle-earth and established their own realms in exile. So Gil-Galad befriends the High King, King Elendil, and builds for him the 3 towers of the Tower Hills, and before he left for the War of the Last Alliance, he was smart enough to pass his elven rings on to his Herald Elrond and his Lieutenant Círdan prior to his demise in said war. And you know the rest of the story from there, because that's where Lord of the Rings begins. So, the important stuff here. Diverging from Gil-Galad's story, sometime around the 800s, Anardil, who would become the aforementioned Tar Eldarion, King of Numenor, visits Gil-Galad, and he's around a century old at this point. His daughter is born in 873 and takes over as the queen in 1075. Tar Eldarion died at 398 years old. That's how long Numenorian nobility lived at this time. That's important, as you can understand their knowledge and power better when they attain it over centuries, and it's during this long span of time that the friendship of the Numenorians and the Noldor is able to form. Nothing happens quickly in Tolkien's Middle-earth. Now, I have to diverge in that way so you can understand what follows. There is a message that Gil-Galad passes on to Tar Eldarion's father, Meneldur, and it is in the Book of Unfinished Tales, Part 2, Chapter 2, of Eldarion and Erendis, and reads as follows. Given at Mithlond to the hand of the Lord Aldarion's heir of Numenor, to be delivered to the High King at Armenelos in person. Arenion Gil-Galad, son of Orodreth, to Tar Meneldur, of the line of Eärendil, greeting. The Valar keep you, and may no shadow fall upon the Isle of Kings. Long have I owed you thanks, for you have so many times sent to me your son Anardil Eldarion, the greatest elf friend that now is among men I deem. At this time I ask your pardon, if I have detained him overlong in my service, For I had great need of the knowledge of men and their tongues, which he alone possesses. He has dared many perils to bring me counsel. Of my need he will speak to you, yet he does not guess how great it is, being young and full of hope. Therefore I write this for the eyes of the king of Numenor only. A new shadow arises in the east. It is no tyranny of evil men as your son believes, but a serpent of Morgoth is stirring, and evil things wake again. Each year it gains in strength, for most men are ripe to its purpose. Not far off is the day, I judge, when it will become too great for the Eldar unaided to withstand. Therefore, whenever I behold a tall ship of the kings of men, my heart is eased, and now I will make bold to seek your help. If you have any strength of men to spare, lend it to me, I beg. Your son will report to you, if you will, all our reasons. But in fine, it is in his counsel, that is ever wise, that when assault comes, as it surely will, we should seek to hold the Westlands, where the Eldar dwell, and men of your race, whose hearts are not yet darkened. At the least, we must defend Eriador, about the long rivers west of the mountains that we name Hithgalia, our chief defence. But in that mountain wall there is a great gap southward in the land of Kelenardon, and by that way, inroad from the east must come. Already enmity creeps along the coast towards it. It would be defended and assaulted unhindered, did we hold some seat of power upon the nearer shore. So the Lord Eldarion long has seen, at Vignalonde by the mouth of the Guathlo, he has long laboured to establish such haven, secure against sea and land, but his mighty works have been in vain. He has great knowledge in such matters, for he learned much of Círdan, and he understands better than any the needs of your great ships, but he has never had enough men, whereas Círdan has no wights or masons to spare. The king will know his own needs, but if he will listen with favour to the Lord Eldarion and support him as he may, then hope will be greater in the world. The memories of the First Age are dim, and all things are in Middle-earth grow colder. Let not the ancient friendship of the Eldar and Dunedain wane also. Behold, the darkness that is to come is filled with hatred for us, but it hates you no less. The great sea will not be too wide for its wings, if it is suffered to come to full growth. Munwë keep you under the one, and send fair seas to your sails. As you can see here, Gil-Galad is not only onto Sauron and the rising evils in the east, although he doesn't know it's Sauron yet. This is over 700 years before the forging of the Rings of Power. In the TV series, Gil-Galad seems to be forestalling Galadriel, who is attempting to warn him of such things. If you think back to my previous two videos in the series on Numenor and Galadriel respectively, you'll note that the time compression of the Second Age is really accelerating here. If this message of rising evil is sent to Numenor in the year 800 or so, and the rings are forged in 1600, and the Tar Palantir is on his deathbed in 3255, the show is condensing the timeline by over 2,455 years. That's almost like having Isildur just being Aragorn's grandfather in the original Peter Jackson films. Sure, it can thematically work on the level of an ancestor being corrupted by the ring, but it's doing such a weird disservice to the source you're adapting from. I'm just going to call this strike one. This is the same Elven king, by the way, who had the foresight to pass his elven rings on to others because he sensed his doom coming, but somehow doesn't have the foresight to stop the elves from drying due to a lack of mithril access in just a year, apparently, it's going to take. It's one of the dumbest plot points in all of fantasy. I mean, Bilbo's mithril shirt, for example, comes from Gondolin. The elves have known and forged mithril for thousands of years by this point, but the TV show wants a MacGuffin. I cannot even talk about his character destruction without constantly bringing up the things around him that don't work, and it's really frustrating when I'm trying to focus on this one issue. He also sends Galadriel west in the show, which isn't his call to make. Valinor is apparently locked away behind clouds across the sea, yet in the book, the world of Arda at this time is flat. You can actually see Valinor from Numenor if you're on a tall tower. Why is Valinor surrounded by magical clouds in the TV series when the magical barrier is yet to exist because the world is not yet round? See? I keep going off on tangents. So where was I? Gil-Galad. Let's talk about the more important character-destroying stuff, and enough diverging into weird tangents. The letter of Gil-Galad openly shows that he is foreseeing disaster well ahead of time, and not only that, he is willing to confide in others, and not only that, but in a mortal man, placing a great deal of trust in them. This is in marked contrast to how he handles Elrond, deliberately leaving vital information about their race hidden from him, as well as hiding his true intentions and talking down to him. The show has turned Gil-Galad from a thoughtful ruler who places his honest trust in others into a scheming king who plays it close to his chest. Further, instead of seeing the peril of the enemy for what it is and shoring up his realm, making up allies, and getting the peoples of Middle-earth together to fight against the evils of Sauron, and attempting to warn and strengthen the realms around him, he is instead sticking his fingers in his ears and pretending evil, and later, Sauron isn't a threat. Furthermore, Gil-Galad is shown to be against the idea of working with Anatar and seeks to prevent others from working with him. Why would he be then aiding Celebrimbor in the creation of the rings? On top of this, how does anyone in the TV show even know that Sauron has re-arisen, or is the identity of Anatar? Gil-Galad doesn't trust him, but Sauron in the books is repentant at the end of the First Age and seemingly no longer evil. He's left to be. He simply isn't the enemy of Middle-earth until after the forging of the One Ring. Therefore, Gil-Galad is shown to be incompetent, not understand the predicament he and his people are in, not shown to be utilising his allies, and almost actively aiding the enemy by aiding in the forging of the rings. He's secretive and mistrusting as a character to boot, and actively ignores advice from far older and wiser characters such as Galadriel. But, well, she's neither of those things in the TV show, so maybe ignore that last part. Gil-Galad is a totally ruined character compared to the wise elven king of the books, who led his people for over 3,500 years befriending dwarves, befriending green elves and men. And about the only sensible move he's made in the TV show is to give a table to Prince Durin that he's tricked into thinking is sacred after insulting him and insinuating that he's keeping secrets from the Elven King. Seriously, what have they done to this character? Anyway, that's it for me. I want to know what your thoughts are on Gil-Galad, who's really an underutilised and kind of underwritten character. Apart from the show making him into an idiot, he's a pretty badass character in the books, and it's due to his actions that the War of the Last Alliance and the first defeat of Sauron is able to happen, even knowing that it's going to cost his own life to do so. Which also makes him a very selfless king. So yeah, take that into consideration. Anyway, back with the Outer Circle, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all on the next one.